challenge it, routine. Don't worry about specifics. I just want your opinions and your impressions. And
all right, okay. Well, Ben Bradlee was a friend of my husband's for many years before I actually met him. And of course I was instantly seduced by this massive alpha charisma. I mean, he defined the alpha man. He really did. And it was just this sunshine presence that was so utterly seductive in every way. So, of course, like every single woman who ever met Ben, I fell hopelessly in love with him. I think what Ben had was this huge vitality, this irreverence, this sense of loving life, and a kind of man-about-town sophistication, too, which was very movie star and very unlike anybody else, really, in newspapers. You know, the man brought, you felt that he'd lived the kind of life that, you know, only happens in the kind of the Hemingway era, you know, Paris and journalism at its most carousing and swaggering and big scoops and big stories and women and fun, and it was all fun. And I think the fun that Ben brought to the job was one of the things that people just loved to it, was that to be around him was serious fun. You know, you were doing important things, but this man had such a sense of humor, such a kind of wonderful, you know, insouciance, that it was really great to be around him, and it made people, you know, it lifted you up. It made you feel buoyant. I would not describe him as an intellectual, Ben. No, he really, he had this great, you know, viscera, this great gut, this great sense and nose, you know, for a great story. But he also had something else, which is knowing who should write the story too, which is a very, very important thing an editor needs to do, is to cast that talent for the story involved. And that's a big thing to be able to do. You need to say, no, put so-and-so on it, not him or her. And know instinctively that's the right match, that this guy or this woman has got what it takes to bring that story out that you have in mind. And then he wouldn't interfere. He had actually, once he'd done the big things, say the story was what he wanted to do, pursue it, cast it, then he would like leave it to the people concerned and come back in when it needed to be just tilted this way. I think a journalist, a great editor, has to have just incredible sense, a curiosity, you know, a real curiosity that's piqued by that story that's buried in there, in the news, you know, that you say, wait a minute, why did this happen? To have a genuine instinct for an unanswered question is a very important thing for an editor. And I really think that Ben had that. He listened. He was enormously, you know, had great social skills. So he would be talking and he would listen, but he would get what the angle was, what the new angle was. And, you know, he also had a great sense of, you know, where to get the next follow-up, where to get the information, because he was a man who moved in the corridors of power, and he could, you know, he would fling the tips out to his reporters. And, you know, again, many editors are kind of reclusive, they're hermetic, but not Ben Bradlee. You know, he was very much a man of the world. He was in those corridors of power, but he wasn't seduced by them. He always was the irreverent, you know, the iconoclastic one who could move in those corridors, who was absolutely a man about town, but at the same time, he never lost the sense that what he was doing there was getting the stories. What he was doing was bringing back, you know, the gold for the newsroom, and he did a lot of that. Ben was very much a man of taste and refinement, and sometimes he would hide that in a sort of his profane, you know, sort of swaggering stance. But actually, underneath that, he had enormous taste, you know, a real sense of a sentence, a tremendous interest in and appreciation of the refined moment in a piece that was just made it special, or the phrase that the writer had nurtured, that, you know, that they knew was the best thing about the piece, but others with less discernment might not have seen. And it really sort of ran in his blood, because his great uncle, of course, was Frank Crowninshield, who was the founder of Vanity Fair, the great Vanity Fair in the 20s. Ben was Benjamin Crowninshield Bradlee. And Ben was, you know, tremendously helpful to me when I took over Vanity Fair. I mean, he sat me down and talked to me about Frank Crowninshield, what made him great, his incredible sort of mix, of the high-low mix of Vanity Fair, which was the mischief combined with the depth, you know, the acerbic writing combined with the seduction of the photographs, and how, you know, the whole voice of the magazine was so important. Ben really understood about voice, which of course is something he brought to the style section. So this was wonderful when I came to New York. Well, Ben's invention of the style section was as great a legacy for him, I think, as Watergate, which he's, of course, much more famous for. But with style, he took this very sort of timid thing, which was called For and About Women, I think, at the time. And he really broke out the notion of a kind of woman's pages in that kind of timid, spinstery sound, and turned it into this great jazz band of a section, which was about doing your best, most flamboyant work. It was about bringing high-low mix. It was about features done with a lot of literary style. It was about combining a sense of the society with a sense of politics, with a sense of literature, and being able to mix them all together in this great sort of choreography that was the style section. And in that section, he brought on all these terrific writers who created their own sort of ethos of literary journalism. I mean, people like Remnick were writing about, Gorbachev's first girlfriend. There was Tom Shales doing TV. There were people like Nicholas von Hoffman doing incredible work, and of course Sally Quinn, who sort of invented the strip the bark off profile, where she brought her wonderful social eye to the world of politics and power. So, the style section was then emulated by every newspaper in America. I mean, he totally revolutionized the way American newspapers covered features, in a sense. And I think that legacy sort of remains. I mean, frankly, nothing is as lively right now as Ben Bradlee's style section, which became the must-read of the newspaper. It was the kind of beating heart of, the must-read factor of the Washington Post under Bradlee. Undoubtedly, they were sort of brothers in style, brothers in ethos, brothers in man-about-townness, and also brothers, I think, in the democratic ideals. I think he really felt that Kennedy was, if he'd been in politics, he would have been Kennedy. The interesting thing about Ben was that he was so much more charismatic than any movie star, that played him. He was more charismatic than Jason Robards. And I think a bit of him probably also felt a little competitive in some ways with JFK. That this was one of the things that sort of gave Ben his edge, which is that he himself clearly could have been presidential material had he decided to go into politics. I think he would have always thought journalism was a lot more fun, but there was probably a little piece of him that looked at JFK at the time and thought, that could have been me. I think everyone around JFK was seduced by his style, the style of Jackie and JFK. I mean, here were two people that were young, they were elegant, they were cultured, they were sexy and alpha in every way. And so was the Washington they created. I mean, I think the glamour of Kennedy was that he always picked the best minds who also had a sense of sophistication and worldliness and an ability to live a life that was also interesting and wasn't some kind of, Mandarin boffin existence, but was actually people who were in the arena. And all of that came to Washington at the same time and created a real moment socially that was probably more exciting than we've ever seen before or since. I think Ben often played Ben Bradlee, and I think the most interesting way that he deployed his Ben-ness was in his relationship with Katharine Graham, because that was a kind of a chemistry that he kept in very careful calibration. It could have blown up into something unmanageable because Ben was so wildly attractive. I am sure that Kay Graham must have been really, at heart in love with Ben, but he would have never let that get to a point where it was somehow an issue. And for him, he knew that to keep that relationship in the equilibrium of her obvious, attraction to him and her sense of that he's irresistible, with also a sense of his respect for her as the owner of the Washington Post, which could not go awry. And I know that there was a moment when Ben fell in love with Sally. There was a very tricky passage in the relationship with Katharine Graham. And frankly, I think the tacitness of that was that she was probably jealous. It was one thing for Ben to be a married man with whom she had that calibration, Kay. Another thing when he left his wife for a younger woman who he clearly was absolutely crazy about, that was threatening to Kay. So I think that was a difficult passage that both of them had to play with a great deal of care. I think the critical relationship of anyone who's an editor is with the proprietor of the paper, the magazine, because if this goes awry, it just can't work. The great successful publications have always been where the editor and the owner, the proprietor, have been in sync in such a way that there was mutual respect, a sense that the editor really was in charge of the daily, vitality of the news entity, but the editor had enough care and enough shrewdness, frankly, to be able to kind of manage up and to be shrewd about at what point to flout that responsibility and to not get too big-headed about thinking that, okay, I am in charge, but at times I have to make it clear that I also know I'm an employee. And Ben was very, very smart about the way he played Kay Graham. I think being attacked by power is something that Ben completely had the assurance to deal with. I mean, I think at times it must have been very difficult for him, but also I think he never had any doubt this is what he should be doing, that this is what he was for, that his toughness, this is, his whole swagger had been kind of made for this moment to have it tested. I mean, was he really a person of steel, or was he somebody who was playing one? But I think that the Kay Graham's backing was enormously important to him. He knew that Kay Graham had his back, and knowing that gave him the fortitude to tough it out. I mean, she was the critical figure behind him, because had she not, it would have all been over. Because if they could have gone over his head to Kay, they would have done, and they tried. But she wasn't having any of it, and that is where Kay's absolute loyalty to Ben and, frankly, her love of Ben, I think, was such an enormously important factor in the success of that whole Watergate period. It's too early for us to say whether Nixon and Trump, are soul brothers. I actually think Trump is a far cruder kind of a strongman. I think Trump is going to be seen to have more in common with Erdogan in Turkey, frankly, than really with Richard Nixon, who was a far more complicated and really intellectually formidable opponent than Trump was, with dark flaws that were then playing out on the national stage. Trump, though, has absolutely no regard for the truth, and I think has far less control of his own impulses than Richard Nixon did. Well, I think every editor dreads having a Janet Cooke story. I mean, most editors have some horrific passage they go through where something happened that they just wish to God that they had been more vigilant. I definitely think that the Janet Cooke thing happened because, the Post had been riding the waves of success. There was a hubristic feeling dawning there in which they'd had so much acclaim, so much attention, so much applause that inevitably makes you a little cocky. So in a sense, Janet Cooke was something of an accident waiting to happen, which, is not a bad thing to sort of be a little humbled for, and remember that everything is about building on, the rigor of your reporting. Otherwise, you can be caught, as people have been so many times since. I mean, Janet Cooke was a horrible passage for Ben because it unleashed all the schadenfreude out there. I mean, of course, everybody was so jealous of the Washington Post and of its glamorous editor and its stylish style writers and its huge scoop with Woodward and Bernstein and the movie that was made of them with the two big movie stars. I mean, there was a real sense of, like, we want to bring them down. And, of course, he was trashed. And it reminded Ben strongly, because you had a sense, Ben, always of the knives being out. He was aware of it, and he knew that jealousy was a dangerous thing. He was a little paranoid in some ways at times, I think, deep down about, certainly Sally has been, about what was awaiting out there if you stumbled. And although he had such insouciance and he was so above it, nonetheless, he knew that the forces of destruction were there, and I think he never really forgot that. He certainly didn't ever forget it after Janet Cooke. Ben never looked back. It was one of the most appealing things about him, in a sense. He was a creature of the moment, of our times. He didn't believe in looking back. He didn't gloat on his laurels. He was the least sort of pretentious, standing on his own reputation. He was always moving forward. you know, he would say, you know, head up, ass down, move forward. That was one of his things he loved to say when, you know, he said if things get tough, that's what you need to do. And that's what he did, absolutely, every single day. But, you know, his life was greatly changed when he fell in love with Sally. And then had with Quinn a son who, you know, caused him to really, I think, change a great deal. You know, I think that Ben was always a man with a great heart. And was always a person of great personal kindness and largesse towards people. But I think that his love of Quinn was a very transforming thing and a very bonding thing with Sally. And that probably gave him the most cause for really, you know, more introspection and reflection. Because, you know, it was a very painful thing sometimes to have to you know, try to figure out ways to make this, you know, beautiful boy they had as happy as they wanted to make him, because, you know, he had challenges. Well, when Sally and Ben became a couple, you know, you had the combination of this amazing social energy as well as professional stardust. So their drawing room, you know, Sally's a very talented hostess and she understands how to put together and organize. I mean, she's a general's daughter, and to be socially effective, you need to know, you need to be buttoned up. You know, you need to know how to get that done, how to run a dinner party, how to seat a dinner party, how to preside. So the interesting thing about Sally was that although she was often, as a style reporter, the person who would be, you know, very irreverent about the grand dames of Washington, actually she really was a latent grand dame herself, in the sense that Sally knows how to run a dinner party. She knows how to be herself, you know, a chatelaine. I don't believe for a minute that Ben didn't know that JFK was a philanderer, but I think he belongs to that generation of gentleman's code, which is that you don't inform on your friends' peccadillos. So I certainly don't believe for one moment that he didn't know, because I think everybody who was a friend of Ben's, of JFK, knew. Well, I think when the Vietnam War was getting people so incredibly upset that the link between lying and public officials became such an issue in American life that the whole idea of scrutiny to the nth degree began to take over as the ethos of journalism. And that included private life. And the notion that character was now an issue that was in the public domain to be explored, and that issues of character, including issues such as infidelity or promises you'd made to your wife, vows that you now were breaking, then became up for grabs. At Vanity Fair at the time, we did a major story on Gary Hart and went with Gail Sheehy, who did a series of political profiles then, which actually examined the private lives of all of the candidates at the time and took the completely personal approach to the reporting of power, and were very successful. I mean, they felt like sort of breakthrough big magazine pieces which were dealing with politics in different kinds of ways. And I know the style section was very much doing that kind of coverage. Even though Bradlee was loved kind of swaggering, reckless journalism in a sense, he also was very protective and careful when it came to the average citizen being written about. And although he was willing to be wildly iconoclastic about public figures, about the big shots, about, you know, the people who really could command the world stage, if the reporters were writing about a citizen, he would say, remind me why we're destroying this reputation. You know, is this necessary? Are you sure? And I think that's a critical difference between his kind of bravura and what has really become a sort of reckless tearing of reputations to pieces. He was not reckless about tearing reputations to pieces. I think Ben would have been appalled by the current media environment because it was like a travesty of everything he believed in. I mean, he was about rigor. He was about pursuing the big story. He was about getting it right. And he was about judgment and taking care. And only by taking care could you do the big stories and the big shots. So I think he would have been extremely disturbed by the fake news phenomenon, by the casual and lazy pursuit of crowdthink, which is where we're living now. I really regret that there is no Ben Bradlee to be standing up for it.